Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise to speak on the title clause of this GCSB bill. I'd just like to, just before I start, to acknowledge the death a week ago of Bob Leonard, who was one of the founders of the anti-basis campaign. He'll be well known to many people as dressing up as Uncle Sam at many of the Waihopai protests. And it was people like Bob Leonard who drew attention to the GCSB and the role of the GCSB long before many in the mainstream perhaps had picked up and understood its full significance. And I think he would have very much appreciated the fact that the GCSB is now front and centre of the national debate, as indeed it should be. Mr Speaker, in this title debate, I would just like to talk about some aspects of the bill that that haven't come up so much before, and one of them is the impact on the New Zealand's ICT sector, which I think is has not been properly covered. Ian Apperley has written an article in the NBR I think in the last couple of days. He's a cloud computing expert, and he's talked about the impact of both the GCSB bill and the TICS bill, which is its partner bill, if you like, on the New Zealand ICT sector. Why this is important is that this GCSB bill won't just affect the government, so the Government Communications Security Bureau bill, but it has a big impact particularly on cloud computing. And what we've seen, and the reason why it has a big impact on cloud computing is because of the access that it provides to government agencies to intercept all of the data that companies and individuals might be putting up into the cloud. The TICS bill, the parallel bill to this one, requires that providers of such services, as well as internet service providers, install a backdoor into their services through which the government can simply help themselves to the information contained. Now, what this means is that instead of the government having to go through the front door and make requests and present warrants and so forth, the government can simply stick its hand into the cloud or into the data that's stored and take it without having to go through the front door of the company. So what this means is that the GCSB bill, which empowers the government to acquire all this information, and the TICS bill, which runs in parallel, which makes it technically possible and very simple for the government to get the information. The TICS bill is interesting as well because it can also gag the companies from telling anyone that the government has installed a backdoor on their systems. What this means is that there's been a flood of companies leaving the United States now. So the PRISM system, which has been established in the United States, you've probably got, I mean, in the article that's in the NBR, they talk about 10% of all the contracts have been cancelled across the United States now. This is many tens of billions of dollars worth of business is now leaving the United States because the United States is no longer a secure environment in which to store data because of the PRISM system and because of the backdoors that have been installed in all these data storage systems. This is a very significant development. And what we've seen in Switzerland, which bases itself on a secure data model, is that they've had a doubling of their cloud computing services and the money that's being spent in Switzerland on cloud computing as they've established themselves as a secure location for information. This is a very significant development for the ICT sector in New Zealand. And what we don't realise, and this government attempt to cripple the New Zealand ICT sector is estimated by the article in the in the NBR that it would cost somewhere in the order of $2 billion over 3 years in terms of lost business for the New Zealand ICT sector. So this is a sector which is growing rapidly and should be part of New Zealand's future. It's part of a smarter, greener economy for New Zealand. It deals with some of the issues around our distance from our markets because, of course, information is gravity-free, so that it's a great way for us to make money while being a long way from our markets. And of course we have access to renewable energy, so there are some real advantages for New Zealand in the ICT sector in terms of building a smarter, greener economy. But the bill that the national government is supporting will cripple the New Zealand ICT sector. That's coming from the experts themselves in the cloud computing area and in the New Zealand ICT sector. And that's why we've seen such strenuous opposition coming from many of the leading companies involved there. What this means is that the government, which prides itself and tells us how great they are in terms of economic policy, is in fact passing a piece of legislation which cripples one of New Zealand's growing and quite important sectors, which is the ICT sector. And I think that is a little understood part of this whole debate. The other part that I think is important if we're debating the title, which is supposed to be the Government Communications Security Bureau, is who on earth does this agency really work for? And this is the whole issue about the global framework for the GCSB within which it operates. Is it, Mr Chair? Mr Chair.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And this is the issue that I've been raising, which is around the issue of funding, but it also relates to the issue of the Five Eyes network. So the GCSB is a member of the Five Eyes network, which includes, essentially is run by the United States, but has a number of smaller countries of Anglo origin involved in it, that is Canada, New Zealand, Australia and the UK. And what has become clear during the revelations from the Snowden leaks is that these 5 countries working together as part of Five Eyes have been spying on a lot of other countries who are now extremely upset with the Five Eyes network and are very unhappy, particularly the European Union countries, that the United States and the United Kingdom have been colluding to spy on all their traffic, on their internet traffic. And that's why the issue of US government funding to the GCSB is critical to this whole debate, and why it has been such a scandal in the United Kingdom when it was revealed that the US government, the NSA, had provided about £100 million in funding to the equivalent of the GCSB in the United Kingdom, that is the GCHQ. Because if these agencies are working independently of the governments that they're supposedly reporting to, because they have independent sources of funding, because the US government will fund them in order to do activities, as we saw in the United Kingdom, then who on earth do they work for? Do they work for us? Are they really the New Zealand Government Communications Security Bureau, or are they some part of the US government? Because if they're taking money, large amounts of money from the US government in order to do what the US government wants them to do, it gives them an element of independence from the New Zealand citizens who are supposed to be controlling them via the elected government, and of course it gives them an independence from the New Zealand taxpayer who provides the money if they have their own sources of income. So my challenge to the Prime Minister is, he said that, under various circumstances he would resign if it was turned out that they were involved in mass surveillance and so forth. Well, my challenge to him is, will he resign if it is discovered that the GCSB is in receipt of foreign money? That's my challenge to the Prime Minister. He said, well, this mass surveillance thing, that won't happen, and I'll resign if anyone finds out that I've been engaging in mass surveillance. Of course, how would we find out? Because it all operates secretly. So he does have that very important caveat. But will he resign if it turns out to be the case that not only was the NSA providing £100 million, hundreds of millions of New Zealand dollars, to the equivalent in the United Kingdom, but the NSA was also providing millions of dollars to the GCSB in New Zealand or other such support? Will the Prime Minister resign? Because he refuses to answer the question as to the funding of the GCSB and whether it takes foreign government's money. Now, what other government organisation would we think it was acceptable for them to be working for another government? What other government organisation will we go, OK, that's OK, you're funded by another government, a foreign government, and you're working for that other government, that's an acceptable modus operandi, and you won't even tell us how much money you're taking from the US government. It seems to me it is fundamental to our democratic structure and the accountabilities to this Parliament that the GCSB and the minister responsible should be forced to tell us, as the New Zealand citizens, whether the GCSB is in receipt of money from a foreign government. But the Prime Minister has repeatedly refused to answer the question. Now, my suspicion is this: if he could deny it, he would. If the Prime Minister could deny that the GCSB was in receipt of money from a foreign government, he would deny it, because it's very damaging. But he refuses to deny that the GCSB has been in receipt of money from a foreign government. And that leads me to the conclusion that it is more than likely that the GCSB, just like its equivalent in the United Kingdom, has taken money from the US government, and hence they don't just work for us. In fact, they also work for others. And that is entirely the problem of the oversight function. When you have a rogue agency like this, which is not only breaking the law repeatedly, but also possibly, or quite probably, in receipt of money from the US government, it is very critical that we have proper oversight in place, and we do not have that kind of oversight. And it is for that reason that the Green Party has consistently supported the call for a proper inquiry, and we will be supporting Grant Robertson's amendment on the title clause so that there is a proper inquiry before this legislation ever comes into force. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chairman.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Chairman, I want to support